Black model pulled a stranger onto the dance floor to save his life, not knowing he was Korea's deadliest mafia boss. Safiya's fingers closed around the stranger's hand before she could talk herself out of it. He was Korean, mid-30s, dark burgundy suit that said old money without trying. Eyes like polished obsidian, studying her the way a chess player studies a board before delivering the final move. "Dance with me," she said, her voice low and tight. He didn't move. "I don't dance." Safiya held his gaze and tightened her grip. "You do tonight." She leaned closer so only he could hear. "Unless you want to die right here in that seat." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear, men like him didn't do fear, but calculation, reassessment. He stood. They moved onto the dance floor together, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead. Seoul's most powerful, most glamorous, most untouchable filled every corner of the room. Celebrities, diplomats, business elites draped in designer gowns and quiet arrogance. Safiya was supposed to be performing tonight, not dragging a VIP guest onto the marble floor by sheer desperation. The man moved stiffly. Stiff the way people move when they're not used to being told what to do. "What exactly is happening right now?" he asked calmly. "I'm saving your life," Safiya whispered back. "Just keep dancing, please." His eyes searched her face. Whatever he found there, the fear she couldn't hide, the certainty she couldn't fake, made him stay. They danced. The room watched, confused, curious, whispering. And exactly 3 minutes later, the massive glass chandelier sculpture above the VIP table cracked loose from its support cable and came crashing down in a thunderous explosion of crystal, sparks, and chaos onto the exact seat where the man had been sitting. Screams ripped through the ballroom. Glass flew. Guests scattered. Security surged. The man stood perfectly still on the dance floor, staring at the wreckage, at the shattered crystals spread across the marble, at the twisted metal that had been, moments ago, above his head. Then he turned slowly to Safiya. "How?" he said quietly. "Did you know that would happen? To understand that moment, you have to go back 6 hours earlier." Safiya Adeola stepped out of the taxi in front of the Imperial Crown Hotel and tilted her head back to take in the full height of it. Glass and light, steel and sky, the kind of building that didn't ask to be noticed, it simply was. She slung her garment bag over one shoulder, exhaled slowly, and walked toward the entrance. Tonight was the International Cultural Gala. High profile, high stakes, a glittering fundraiser packed with celebrities, diplomats, and the kind of businessmen whose names ran countries without appearing on ballots. Safiya had been hired as one of the runway performers, part of an evening showcase blending Korean tradition with African elegance. It wasn't the dream, but after 8 months of closed doors, polite rejections, and casting directors who looked straight through her, Safiya had stopped waiting for the dream to arrive on its own. She came from Lagos to Seoul to build something, and she was still building, even if tonight's foundation looked a little like borrowed time. Backstage was organized chaos. Models weaved between stylists. Designers crouched at the hems of gowns. Music thundered through the walls like a second heartbeat. Safiya found her station, slipped into her costume. A breathtaking blue hanbok-inspired gown that felt like 2 worlds sewn together, and was running the choreography in her head when she heard the voices. 2 men, standing near the service corridor, speaking Korean low and deliberate. Safiya didn't mean to listen, but then a single phrase cut through the backstage noise and stopped her cold. "Midnight signal, chandelier cable." She didn't move. "The target sits beneath it. VIP table." Her stomach dropped. She shifted quietly and angled her gaze around the corner. Both men wore black suits. They didn't have the posture of hotel staff. They had the posture of people who were never surprised by anything. "The cable will snap when the signal triggers," one said flatly. "No witnesses," the other replied. Footsteps. A door clicked shut. They were gone. Safiya pressed herself back against the wall, her pulse hammering in her ears. Had she just overheard a murder plot? She tried to reason it away. Maybe she'd misunderstood. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe VIP table. Chandelier cable. The words wouldn't leave. Family, before we go any further, drop your city in the comments right now. Where are you watching from? And if you're already hooked, hit that subscribe button because this story is about to go somewhere you are not ready for. The gala began. Hundreds of guests filled the glittering ballroom. The chandeliers, enormous, blazing, hung overhead like floating constellations. Safiya stepped onto the stage with the other models, the music swelling beneath her feet. She walked. She hit every mark. She held every pose. But her eyes kept drifting upward, toward the chandelier above the VIP section. And then she saw him, sitting alone directly beneath it, tall, calm, dressed in a dark burgundy suit. Unlike every other guest in the room, he wasn't performing wealth or performing power. He simply had it the way gravity has mass. 2 bodyguards flanked him at a careful distance. He surveyed the room with the measured stillness of someone who had never needed to prove anything to anyone. Safiya's breath caught. Was he the target? Her segment ended. The models turned to exit. Safiya didn't move. Every rational part of her brain said walk away. She was a performer, not a hero. She could ruin her career. She could ruin everything she'd spent 8 months barely holding together. But she looked up at the chandelier. And she remembered the men's voices. And she walked straight across the marble floor, past rows of Seoul's most powerful people, through the stiffening posture of 2 bodyguards who didn't quite move fast enough, and stopped directly in front of him. She extended her hand. Dance with me. 6 hours earlier. The taxi pulled up to the Imperial Crown Hotel and Safiya Adeola stepped out slowly, tilting her head back to take in the full weight of the building. Glass and steel. Light and ambition. The kind of structure that didn't ask to impress you, it simply did. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds, garment bag over one shoulder, the cool Seoul evening brushing against her skin. Then she exhaled, squared her shoulders and walked forward. Tonight is different, she told herself. She had been telling herself that for 8 months. She had arrived in Seoul from Lagos with one suitcase, one dream, and a confidence that her mother said bordered on stubbornness. International modeling. Runways, campaigns, covers, the kind of career that didn't just happen in Lagos or London but everywhere at once. Seoul had other plans. Korean agencies smiled politely and said she was too different. Designers told her they weren't sure how to position her look. One casting director, without blinking, told her the market wasn't ready. For what? She had wanted to ask. For me? She hadn't asked. She had thanked him and walked out and cried in the stairwell where no one could see her. That was month 2. By month 5 she had stopped crying and started grinding. Small gigs, background work, a hair product campaign that paid just enough to cover rent. She took every opportunity, no matter how small, because small opportunities were still open doors, and closed doors were what she had left behind in Lagos. The International Cultural Gala was different. A genuine stage, a real audience. Celebrities, diplomats, business elites, the kind of crowd where careers could shift in a single night. Safiya had been selected to perform in a showcase blending Korean tradition with African design. It wasn't the headline slot, but it was visible. And visible was everything. Tonight, she reminded herself again as she pushed through the service entrance, is different. Backstage was beautiful chaos. Stylists darted between stations with pins clenched between their teeth. Makeup artists worked with the focused urgency of surgeons. Designers crouched at the floors adjusting hemlines with the expression of people for whom perfection was personal. Music pulsed through the walls from the ballroom beyond, low and steady, like a countdown. Safiya found her station and began preparing. She unzipped her garment bag and carefully lifted out the gown. It stopped her every time she saw it. A breathtaking blue hanbok-inspired fusion piece, deep and rich in color. The silhouette drawing from Korean traditional structure while the fabric detailing wove in unmistakably West African pattern work. 2 worlds. 1 garment. The designer had called it a conversation between cultures. Safiya called it the most beautiful thing she had ever worn. She stepped into it, adjusted the fit, and studied herself in the mirror for a long moment. For the first time in 8 months, She felt exactly like the version of herself she had packed into that suitcase back in Lagos. She was ready. Then she heard the voices. Two men, standing near the backstage service corridor to her left. Speaking Korean, low, deliberate, the way people speak when they're certain no one important is listening. Safiya wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She turned back to the mirror, focusing on her reflection. But then one phrase cut cleanly through the noise of the entire room and wrapped itself around her chest like a cold hand. Midnight signal, chandelier cable. Safiya went completely still. The target sits beneath it. VIP table. Her eyes met her own reflection in the mirror. And for the first time all evening, the dream felt very, very far away. Safiya didn't move. Not a breath. Not a blink. She stood facing the mirror with her hands folded in front of her, every muscle locked in place. Her eyes fixed straight ahead while her ears reached sideways toward the corridor. The men continued. Their voices were low, the practiced quietness of people who had learned long ago that walls listened. But the backstage noise had dipped at exactly the wrong moment, and every word landed with terrible clarity. The cable will snap when the signal triggers. A pause. No witnesses. Safiya's reflection stared back at her, pale beneath her foundation, eyes too wide. She forced herself to breathe slowly, counted to 3. Then, with the careful casualness of someone who absolutely had not just heard what she heard, she reached up and pretended to adjust her earring, and angled her gaze toward the corridor. Two men in black suits, backs half-turned. One was taller, broader, with the kind of stillness that suggested he had never been nervous in his life. The other spoke with his head tilted slightly downward, like someone reading from a thought rather than a page. She could not see their faces. Then footsteps. A door clicked shut. Gone. Safiya stood alone at her mirror with the silence rushing back in around her. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the makeup table and stared at her reflection until her breathing steadied. Then, slowly, she tilted her gaze upward, past the ceiling of the backstage corridor, through the wall in her imagination, toward the ballroom beyond. She had walked through it earlier during the venue briefing. She knew exactly where the VIP table sat. She knew exactly what hung above it. There's nothing, she told herself. Technical crew. Rigging maintenance. A conversation taken completely out of context by a woman standing too close to a corridor she had no business standing near. Cable. Signal. Target. Those words meant 100 things. She was a model at a gala, not a detective. She had a performance in less than 2 hours. She had everything riding on tonight going perfectly. 8 months of grinding, of swallowing rejection, of telling herself the next opportunity would be the one that mattered. This was the one that mattered. She turned back to her mirror and picked up her lip liner. VIP table. She set it back down. If she was wrong, if she walked up to security right now and reported 2 men for a conversation she'd half overheard through a wall, she could imagine exactly how that played out. The polite but firm escort off the premises. The call to the agency. The quiet blacklisting that didn't announce itself but simply meant the callbacks stopped coming. Everything she had survived 8 months to build, dismantled in one paranoid moment. She picked up the lip liner again. Signal. Cable snapping. No witnesses. She put it down again. The words wouldn't stay quiet. They circled the inside of her mind like something trapped, looking for a way out. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple and exhaled hard through her nose. Ignore it, she told herself firmly. Walk onto that stage and do what you came here to do. The gala began exactly on schedule. Music surged through the walls. The backstage energy shifted. Models straightening, stylists stepping back. The focused hush that fell right before a performance. Safiya took her place in the lineup, smoothed the front of her gown, and lifted her chin. She walked out. The ballroom opened around her. Vast, blazing, magnificent. Hundreds of guests, glittering chandeliers. The long runway cutting through a sea of wealth and elegance. Safiya moved through her choreography, hit every mark. But her eyes, almost against her will, traveled upward, to the chandelier above the VIP section, then downward, to the man sitting directly beneath it, alone, still, completely unaware. And the words came again, quiet, certain, unavoidable. VIP table. Signal. Cable. The target sits beneath it. The ballroom was another world entirely. Safiya had seen beautiful rooms before, in magazines, in the background of campaigns she had auditioned for and not gotten. But this was different. This was the kind of beautiful that had weight to it. Crystal chandeliers blazed like suspended suns. The marble floor reflected everything: light, color, movement, until the room seemed to exist twice. Hundreds of guests moved through it in designer gowns and tailored suits, trailing perfume and quiet power. Seoul's finest. All in one room, all watching. Safiya walked the runway and let the performance take over. Her posture straightened automatically. Her stride lengthened. The gown moved with her the way it was designed to, fluid, deliberate, commanding. Around her the other models hit their marks and the music carried everything forward like a current. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. But her eyes kept drifting left. The VIP section sat elevated slightly from the main floor, roped off from the general crowd by nothing more than the invisible boundary that wealth creates naturally. Round tables dressed in white linen. Crystal glasses catching the light. Guests who carried themselves with the ease of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged in a room. Safiya scanned the table without breaking her stride. And then she found him. He wasn't hard to find. He was the only person in the entire ballroom who wasn't performing. Everyone else was performing wealth, performing connection, performing the particular kind of relaxed confidence that required an enormous amount of effort to maintain. Laughing at the right moments, leaning in, scanning the room for the next important face. This man did none of that. He sat alone at the center of the VIP table, one hand resting on the white linen. His posture neither rigid nor casual, but something precisely between the two. Dark burgundy suit. Notie. His face was sharp and still, the kind of still that wasn't emptiness but deliberate economy, as if he had long ago decided that no expression was worth the energy unless he chose it. He wasn't watching the runway. He was watching the room. All of it. Slowly. Methodically. The way someone watches a room when they're not enjoying it but assessing it, cataloging exits, reading body language, measuring distances between things. Two bodyguards stood at a careful remove behind him. Not hovering, just present. The way shadows are present. Safiya's stride almost faltered. She corrected instantly, but her pulse had already shifted. That was the target. She didn't know how she was certain. Nothing about him announced danger. He was simply a powerful man at a table full of powerful men. But something beneath the surface of him radiated a frequency she could feel from the runway. Something that said the people around him knew, without being told, not to get too close. And directly above his head, the chandelier hung like a held breath. Her segment ended. The music shifted. The models turned in unison toward the stage exit. A clean, synchronized pivot that Safiya had rehearsed 12 times backstage. Her body turned with them. Her feet did not follow. She stood at the edge of the runway while the other models flowed past her. And she stared at the man beneath the chandelier. And she thought about 8 months of struggle and the agency's number in her phone and everything she had promised herself this night would be. Then she looked up at the chandelier one final time. And she walked off the runway in the wrong direction. Security stiffened as she crossed toward the VIP section. She felt the bodyguards register her before she had taken 3 steps. The room noticed, a ripple of confused attention following her path across the marble. She didn't stop. She stopped only when she was standing directly in front of him. He looked up slowly, eyes like polished obsidian, sharp and utterly unreadable, studying her the way someone studies a variable they haven't accounted for. Safiya extended her hand. "Dance with me." He didn't take her hand. He looked at it the way someone looks at something unexpected, not with alarm, but with the careful patience of a man who had learned never to react before he understood. Then he looked up at her. "I don't dance." His voice was calm, measured, the kind of calm that wasn't politeness but control, the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. Safiya didn't lower her hand. "You do tonight." One of the bodyguards shifted behind him. She felt it without looking, the weight of attention, the subtle repositioning of someone preparing to intervene. The surrounding guests had noticed. She could feel the room's curiosity pressing against her like a second presence. She had maybe 10 seconds before security removed her. She leaned forward, dropping her voice until it existed only in the space between them. "That chandelier above your head," she said quietly, "is going to fall. Someone cut the cable. You need to move. Right now." Silence. He studied her face with the same slow precision he had used to study the room, reading her the way someone reads a document for the detail that changes everything. She didn't look away. She needed him to see that she wasn't performing, wasn't confused, wasn't the kind of person who did this for attention. She needed him to see the fear she had been carrying since the corridor, the fear she had spent 2 hours trying to bury under choreography and breathing exercises. It must have worked, because he stood. No announcement. No question. He simply rose from his chair with the unhurried certainty of a man who made decisions and did not revisit them, and he stepped forward. His bodyguards moved instantly, a reflexive half-step toward him. He stopped them with one slight raise of his hand. So slight it was almost nothing. They froze completely. Safiya exhaled. They walked to the dance floor together and the room parted around them the way rooms do for people who carry authority in their posture. Guests turned. Conversations faltered. Someone laughed nervously at something, then stopped. He placed one hand at her waist. She took his other hand and they began to move. He danced the way he did everything else, with controlled, economical precision. No guastid motion. No performance. Just the bare minimum required, executed perfectly. "How long?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the room over her shoulder. 3 minutes from when I approached you." She kept her voice even. "Maybe less now." He nodded once, said nothing further. Safiya counted in her head. 30 seconds. Around them guests watched with unconcealed curiosity. A runway model and an unsmiling man in burgundy. Nobody in the room knew what to make of it. 1 minute. Her hand tightened slightly in his. He noticed but didn't comment. 2 minutes. She found herself staring at his collar, counting her own heartbeats. 3. The sound came first. A sharp metallic crack, clean and sudden above the music, the kind of sound that didn't belong. Then a groan of stressed steel. Then the massive chandelier dropped. It hit the VIP table like a verdict. Crystal exploded outward in a blinding cascade. The table buckled and collapsed beneath the impact. Sparks burst from severed wiring and scattered across the marble floor like burning confetti. Then the screaming started. The ballroom came apart instantly. Guests surging backward, chairs overturning, security shouting into earpieces as they pushed against the tide of panicking bodies. Glass crunched underfoot. Someone fell. The lights above the VIP section flickered and died, casting half the room into jagged shadow. Through all of it, the man beside Safiya didn't move. He stood completely still on the dance floor, watching the wreckage of his table with an expression that revealed nothing. No shock, no relief, no visible acknowledgement that he had just watched his own death play out 3 meters away. Then he turned to Safiya. "You just saved my life." Not a question. Not performed gratitude. Just a fact stated plainly the way he seemed to state everything. Before she could respond, he reached into his inner jacket pocket and produced a card. Slim. Black. No logo. He held it out and she took it with fingers that weren't quite steady. She looked down. Kang Tae-hon. She frowned slightly. The name meant nothing to her. She looked up to say so, and found one of his bodyguards standing close, his expression no longer professionally neutral but tight with something that looked almost like alarm. The bodyguard glanced at the card in her hand, then at her face. Then he leaned in and lowered his voice to almost nothing. "You don't know who he is?" Safiya shook her head slowly. The bodyguard's jaw tightened. "That man you just saved," he said carefully, "is the most powerful crime boss in South Korea." The card felt suddenly very heavy in her hand. Safiya stared at the card. Kang Tae-hon. The name still meant nothing to her. But the bodyguard's expression meant everything. The careful tension in his jaw, the way his eyes moved to the card and back to her face like he was calculating something she didn't have the equation for. "I don't understand," she said. "Crime boss," the bodyguard repeated, quieter this time, as if the words themselves required handling. "The most feared syndicate in South Korea. That is who you just pulled onto a dance floor." The ballroom was still unraveling around them. Security moved in tight formations. Guests pressed toward exits. Someone was crying near the far wall. The wreckage of the VIP table sat in the middle of it all like a punctuation mark. Crystal and twisted metal and the ghost of a near-miss that nobody in the room fully understood yet. Safiya understood it. That was the problem. She became aware of Kang Tae-hoon watching her. He hadn't moved far. He stood 2 steps away with his hands loose at his sides, studying her the way he had studied her on the dance floor, with that same slow, methodical attention that felt less like curiosity and more like assessment. Like he was solving something. Then something shifted in his expression. Barely perceptible. A slight narrowing of focus. "You overheard them," he said. It wasn't a question. Safiya opened her mouth, then closed it. "Backstage," he continued, his voice low and even beneath the surrounding chaos. "Before the performance. You heard something you weren't supposed to hear." He paused. "That's how you knew." She held his gaze. There was no point in denying it. "2 men," she said, "near the service corridor. I didn't see their faces." Tae-hoon was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned to his bodyguard and said something in Korean, short, clipped. The tone of a man issuing instructions he expected followed immediately. The bodyguard nodded and moved away without another word. "What did you just?" "I told him to bring the car around," Tae-hoon said, "and to add you to the security perimeter." Safiya blinked. "I don't need a security perimeter. I'm a model. I'm nobody. I just overheard something by accident and You intervened," he said simply. "I stopped someone from dying. You stopped me from dying." He said it without ego, just precision. "Which means the people who sent those men now know your face. They know you were close enough to hear their plan. They know you acted on it." He let that settle for a moment. "Do you understand what that means?" Safiya understood perfectly. She just didn't want to. "I'll go home," she said, hearing how thin the logic sounded even as she said it. "I'll forget everything. They don't know my name. They don't know who They will find your name by morning." His voice wasn't cruel. It was simply factual, the way a doctor states a diagnosis. "You were on a runway tonight. There are cameras everywhere in that ballroom. They will have your face identified within hours." The noise of the ballroom seemed to recede around her. 8 months. The gown. The runway. The dream that had finally, for one moment before everything shattered, felt close enough to touch. "I came to Seoul to model," she said quietly. "I know," Tae-hoon replied. "I didn't ask for this." "No," he agreed. "You didn't." He looked at her steadily, and for the first time, something beneath the controlled surface of him shifted. Not softness exactly, but something that recognized what she had lost in the last 10 minutes. "But it found you anyway." Across the ballroom, half hidden in the shadow of a service doorway, a man in a black suit stood completely still. His eyes moved from Tae-hoon, alive, composed, untouched, to the girl standing beside him. The girl with the blue gown. The one who had walked across the marble floor and pulled the target off his seat like she had known exactly what was coming. His jaw tightened. The operation was clean. Months of planning. A perfect signal, a perfect cable, a perfect seat. No variables. No witnesses. Until her. He watched Tae-hoon's bodyguard return and form a close perimeter around both of them, around her, and the conclusion was immediate and cold. The boss would need to know, and the girl would need to be dealt with. By midnight, the Imperial Crown Hotel had become a different kind of place. The glamour was gone. The guests had been escorted out in quiet, managed waves. The ballroom, still scattered with broken crystal and overturned chairs, had been sealed behind police tape and the kind of men in plain clothes who didn't introduce themselves. Outside, black vehicles sat at every exit in configurations that were clearly not hotel security. Safiya sat in a small private room off the main lobby, her blue gown still on, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She hadn't been told she could leave. She hadn't been told anything. Taehoon worked the way he moved, with total economy. Through the half-open door she could see him across the corridor, speaking in low Korean to a sequence of men who arrived, received instructions, and departed with the focused urgency of people who understood the cost of wasting his time. No raised voices. No visible anger. Just the quiet, systematic machinery of someone dismantling a problem. One of his men placed a tablet in front of him. Taehoon studied it briefly, said 3 words, and handed it back. His bodyguard appeared in Safiya's doorway 20 minutes later. The attack came from a rival organization, he said, with the blunt efficiency she was beginning to recognize as the house style. They've been trying to move against Mr. Kong for some time. Tonight was their most serious attempt. Safiya absorbed this. Was it the last? The bodyguard's silence was its own answer. More are coming, she said flatly. Likely. She looked back at her cold tea. Outside Seoul carried on, indifferent, blazing, enormous. Completely unaware that the world had rearranged itself inside this building tonight. Over the following days, Taehoon's protection settled around Safiya like a shadow she hadn't agreed to and couldn't shake. A car appeared outside her apartment building each morning, sleek, black, engine running. When she arrived at agency calls, which she forced herself to keep attending because she refused to let the dream die quietly in a hotel corridor, someone was always nearby. Never intrusive, never visible to anyone but her. But there, she told herself, it unsettled her. It did, but not entirely in the way she expected. She began to notice things about him that the bodyguard's introduction hadn't covered. He didn't waste words, but the words he chose were precise. He had rules. She observed them in the way his men operated, in the things they didn't do as much as the things they did. No civilians harmed. No unnecessary exposure. No chaos for its own sake. For a man whose name apparently made investigators nervous and rivals disappear, there was a discipline to him that didn't fit the shape she'd constructed in her mind. One evening he appeared briefly at the doorway of the safe house they'd moved her to on the second night. He didn't come inside. You had an agency appointment this morning, he said. She looked up. You're having me followed. I'm having you protected. A pause. There's a difference. Is there? He studied her for a moment. How did it go? She almost didn't answer. They said I showed promise. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Then he was gone. The message reached his security team on a Thursday. Intercepted communications from the rival organization. Fragmented, partially coded, enough to assemble into something coherent and immediate. Taehoon read it once, then called his head of security. Increase the perimeter, he said. The threat is confirmed? Taehoon set the report down on the desk. The rival organization had concluded what he already knew, that Safiya had overheard enough to become a liability, that she had a face and a name and an address, that she had cost them their cleanest opportunity in years. Yes, he said quietly. Who's the target? He looked at the name printed at the bottom of the intercepted message. Safiya Adeola. The girl, he said. Move her tonight. The safe house was a clean, spare apartment on the 14th floor of a building that didn't appear on any public registry. Safiya had been moved there Thursday night without ceremony. 2 bags, 1 bodyguard, 0 explanation beyond its necessary. By Friday evening, she had reorganized every surface she was permitted to touch and was sitting at the kitchen table when Taehoon arrived. She didn't wait for him to speak. Why do you live like this? He paused just inside the doorway. The question had landed differently than he expected. Not angry, not afraid, just direct, almost clinical. That's not a simple question, he said. I have time. He looked at her for a moment. Then, with the same quiet economy he brought to everything, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't tell her everything. She understood that. Men like him had entire architectures of silence built specifically to protect information from people exactly like her. But he told her enough. His father had run legitimate businesses built on illegitimate foundations, the kind of empire that looked clean from the outside and required a particular kind of son to maintain. Taehoon had understood the inheritance before he was old enough to refuse it. By the time he was old enough, refusal was no longer a viable option. Enemies had already formed. Alliances had already been made in his name. You could have walked away, Safiya said. People would have died if I had. People die anyway. Fewer, he said simply. With me managing it, fewer. She studied him across the table. It was the kind of logic she wanted to argue with and couldn't quite, which irritated her more than a clean contradiction would have. You've been running damage control on something you never chose, she said slowly. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. That doesn't make it right, she added. No, he agreed. It doesn't. The honesty of it silenced her for a moment. She had expected deflection, or the cold authority he wore in public like a second suit. Not this, not a man sitting across a kitchen table in a borrowed apartment, agreeing with her assessment of his own life without flinching. You're not afraid of me, he said. It wasn't an accusation. More like something he was noting for the record. Should I be? He considered it genuinely. Most people are. Most people haven't watched you dance stiffly in a ballroom to save your own life, she said. The almost smile appeared again. Faster this time. Over the following days she watched him work. Not with violence, but with precision. The rival organization had made their move and he was responding not with retaliation but with architecture, quietly collapsing the structures they depended on, removing access points, redirecting alliances. His men moved on his instructions like pieces on a board he alone could read completely. It was ruthless, but it was also, she realized slowly, controlled. Deliberate. Designed to end something rather than escalate it. She found herself watching him more than she intended to. The way he listened fully without interrupting. The way he made decisions without performing them. The way he had asked, in a hotel corridor surrounded by wreckage, how her agency appointment had gone. You may be changing him, something in her said. She pushed the thought away immediately, then retrieved it quietly and looked at it again. He found her on the balcony that evening, watching the Seoul skyline burn gold against the early dark. He stood beside her without speaking for a while. Then, the organization responsible. We've identified the leadership. What happens now? It ends, he said, carefully, completely. She turned to look at him. And me? Taehoon looked out at the city for a long moment. When he turned to her, his expression had the same composure as always. But beneath it, something had settled. Something decided. Anyone who tries to hurt you, he said quietly, will regret it. Not a performance. Not reassurance designed to manage her. Promise. Stated the way he stated everything. Once, plainly, with the full weight of a man who kept his word because breaking it was something he had never learned to do. Safiya looked back at the skyline and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. 3 months later, Seoul looked different. Not the city. The city was exactly as it had always been, vast and indifferent and blazing with its own momentum. But Safiya moved through it differently now. With the particular confidence of someone who had been tested by something real and discovered, with some surprise, that she had not broken. The gala story had spread the way only the most extraordinary stories do. Organically, unstoppably, passed between people who couldn't quite believe it and couldn't stop repeating it. A model who had overheard an assassination plot and walked across a ballroom to save a stranger's life. The chandelier captured on security footage, the crash, the aftermath. No names attached to the man she had saved. That detail had been carefully managed by people far more practiced at managing details than hotel security. But Safiya's face had been everywhere. And fashion, as it turned out, was paying attention. The callbacks came first. Then the offers. Designers who had previously looked through her began looking at her. Not despite the fact that she was different, but because of it. The narrative had shifted and she had shifted with it, not by changing anything about herself but simply by being, undeniably, someone who acted when it mattered. 1 campaign, then 2. A spread in a Korean fashion publication that ran her image across a full double page with a headline she read 3 times before she believed it. She called her mother from the lobby of the agency that signed her and cried for 4 minutes flat. Her mother said she always knew. Safiya said she hadn't always known. Her mother said that was the point. The threat had dissolved the way Taehoon had promised. Completely, carefully, with no public trace. His empire had stabilized with the quiet finality of something built by someone who understood that lasting power required structure, not spectacle. His men moved differently now. The tension that had lived in the corners of every room during those first weeks had receded. He had done what he said he would do. He always did. They had spoken less frequently over the past month. Not by design, but by the natural drift of 2 lives returning to their own shapes. Safiya had her career. He had his empire. The intersection that had forced them together was closing. She told herself this was uncomplicated. She almost believed it. The runway show was held in a converted gallery space in Gangnam. High ceilings, industrial bones dressed in white light, 300 guests seated in precise rows along a central runway that seemed to glow from beneath. Safiya stood backstage in a gown that felt like a statement. Deep crimson architectural shoulders, the kind of design that required the person wearing it to be entirely present inside it. The stylist made a final adjustment. The model beside her said something encouraging. The music began its low build beyond the curtain. She breathed in slowly. 8 months of closed doors. 1 night that shattered everything. 3 months of building something new from the pieces. She walked out. The lights hit her and the room received her, and she moved through it the way she had always known she could, with full possession of every step, every angle, every moment of the long runway stretching ahead of her. She didn't look at the audience. Models didn't look at the audience. But at the far end of the runway, at the turn, her gaze moved once, briefly, instinctively, to the standing figures along the back wall. He was there. No front row seat. No announcement. Simply standing at the edge of the room in a dark suit, arms loose at his sides, watching with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. Not the expression of a man performing pride, but of one genuinely experiencing it. Privately, in the way he did everything that actually mattered to him. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Then Safiya turned and walked back down the runway and let the lights have her completely. The night Safiya Adeola pulled a stranger onto a dance floor, she didn't just save a life. She changed 2 destinies forever. If you enjoyed the story this far, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter and enjoy more story from us. And if this story gave you chills, drop a like and share it with someone who loves powerful romance with a dangerous edge. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you.